This lecture will continue to look at the spread of Rococo throughout Europe, beginning in Germany and then turning to the effects of the Enlightenment in England as well. While the Enlightenment is most commonly related to the 18th century, it actually originated in the 17th in Britain, but it did culminate with these French philosophes in the 18th century, those such as Voltaire, Diderot, D'Alembert, and others that are going to argue for the power of reason and rationality over faith and religion. Previously, in the 17th century, the organization of the universe, both metaphysically and religiously, was understood in the great chain of being, that being this Neoplatonic hieratic organization of our entire universe that begins with God in the outermost sphere and brings its way down level by level until we get to men, animals, and minerals here on earth. Thus, everything is dictated and related to the divine. Moving on to the 18th century and the rise of the Enlightenment, there is a questioning of this organization of the world through scientific experimentation. And it was through the success of such salons or social gatherings where we have quick-witted conversation that these ideas are first batted around and eventually are turned into scientific investigation, the publication of encyclopedias, and the spread of scientific knowledge. Here we would have had Madame de Pompadour, the official mistress of Louis XV, in her portrait by Delatour, shown as a woman of good intellect and good taste, surrounded by many of her intellectual interests and achievements. We must imagine the surrounding environment like the Salon de la Princesse and the Hôtel de Sorbis that we looked at last time being the place in which these philosophical debates would take place, questioning these previously held assumptions about the universe and our place in it. Here we find that these aristocrats appreciated a sophistication for various items surrounding her, things that show her erudition and her education, such as the books to her left arm, the globe showing she is worldly and understands geography and is interested in studying different cultures, the sheet music she holds showing an interest in the arts, and the portfolio with drawings and prints off to the side and near her foot, showing, of course, an interest in the visual arts, all of these coming together in this portrait showcasing what was valued by the aristocracy in such an environment. One would be reminded of Hans Holbein the Younger's French Ambassadors, which also showcases a number of still life elements to show how worldly and cultured and learned the men were. The same devices are going to be co-opted and used here for aristocratic purposes. It is not surprising, given what she has showcased surrounding her, to know that Madame de Pompadour was the special protector of the encyclopedia, or the culmination and collection of all knowledge as it is known in the universe. So here, the attempt to categorize and encompass all knowledge, not surprisingly, comes out of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. There was a fascination with technology that gives rise to the Industrial Revolution, first in England and then in Western Europe. Of course, the Enlightenment would be attacked by the Roman Catholic Church because it outright questioned their authority and their teachings on the universe, the organization of it, and man's place within it. This would be reflected outside of the scientific community and politics as well, for John Locke would be one of these philosophers who would give us the model for a rational society in what he called the doctrine of empiricism, whereby he would argue that ideas are formed in our mind and are not innate or in existence outside of our thought. Thus he proposed a tabula rasa, that we are born as a blank slate and we learn as we grow and become educated. Thus, this challenges the divine right of kings because the divine right of kings is predicated on the belief that God is giving the power to specific individuals to become monarchs. In the doctrine of empiricism, we make our decisions on our own, and kings are now merely people like everyone else. Not surprisingly, the founding fathers of America would also point to John Locke, as he would argue, and the French would follow suit here in the end of the 18th century, in stating that if the government fails to protect its citizenry, then that very citizenry had the natural right to revolution. And this led to the revolts against monarchies throughout Western Europe and the world, such as the French Revolution and American Revolution. Now, in this new system and in the Enlightenment, fine arts were given priority because they were perceived directly through the senses and thus did not filter through any other mystical or divine apparatus. So therefore, the visual arts are always important for communicating ideas and truth within the Enlightenment. For instance, Jean-Baptiste Dubois is going to state that pictures, quote, act upon us directly through the organ of sight, and the painter does not employ artificial signs to convey his effect. The pleasure we derive from art is a physical pleasure, end quote. Thus, this is appropriate being written right around the Rococo period, because that's exactly what Rococo art does. It illustrates physical pleasure, and we find this physical pleasure could also be used to incite the spiritual in churches and monasteries. So the style developed for aristocrats in their private residences is adopted, especially in Germany, by the ecclesiastical authorities as an argument for God. Everything. Now, this style becomes very popular and is spread across Europe, much like the earlier, say, International Gothic style was created in Paris and then spread to every country. So especially in in Germany, in Bavaria you see here, is going to remain Catholic. We have the Church of Vierzehnheiligen, or the Church of the 14 Saints. So the Vierzehnheiligen here is going to be made up of a standard Latin cross plan with an elongated nave and longitudinal axis, but the design is going to build on those Baroque architectural monuments we discussed. Right, so we have here the design based after overlapping oval spaces, which again will give us this notion of organic unity that brings everything together. Now, literally, as we will see, the walls growing into the ceilings. So here we have taken from architects like Francesco Borromini at San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane, whereby we repeat the same ovoid shapes, thus relating the space on an interior to everything else. Now, if you look at the interior by Johann Balthasar Neumann, you have the interior of the Church of Vierzehnheiligen here. You are going to see that the effect spectacularly is one of airy lightness, as the colored marble that is chosen for the columns is a light pink. Thus, the ceiling is also painted white, like the sides of the walls in the side aisles. And this is going to make it feel very light, very open, drawing our attention upward, since we have the high altar and the columns on either side growing into, with these whiplashed arabesque patterns, the gilt stucco design. So it draws us into this feeling of a diaphanous cloud-like set of decorations with pastel colors. So we have here in a religious structure the same effect that they were intending in the Salon de la Princesse, which is a home, which is once again someone's town home in Paris. So you can see how it is used in this case to communicate the spectacular spiritual vision of heaven opening up, just like the walls opened up earlier. So you find that looking off to the side, you can see that there is a basic design that the architects are going to lay out and that masons carry out. But then those craftsmen elaborate on that freely, adding these additional elements, these stucco-like arabesque patterns that ensure that there is a organic unity to the interior. Now, the unity of space and of the experience is going to further advance those that were made earlier on in the Baroque, that draws us ever upward with a type of organic lightness that does not hold us down, but instead, through the light streaming in from the interior, reflecting off of the brightly painted walls, we have irregular frames, much like that we saw at Il Gesù by Bocciccio, that are going to open up, right, into heaven itself, into a magical quadratura, as people would refer to it at the time. There is a notable parallel here between Rococo art and the music of the period, such as by Johann Sebastian Bach, George Friedrich Handel, and others, whereby we see the same type of embellishments, where we have a core structure for a musical ensemble and or music itself and the architecture, but we embellish this with grace notes and trills. Therefore, we find these musicians did not write the embellishments, but much like jazz later on, would improvise, much like Rococo architects would design the main structure and then leave the rest to local craftsmen to improvise on top of. The same strategy would be used in ecclesiastical art in Venice as well, which of course is a Catholic city. Here we find that the Rococo in Italy would adopt many of the same light and airy Baroque exuberances as seen in France and use them for a religious context. In Santa Maria del Rosario, we find a good example in a Jesuit church here, the ceiling painting by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo. Here, with the institution of the Rosary, we have this story where Saint Dominic is going to establish the veneration of the Rosary and saying, once again, prayers over these beads. Thus, we find the same exuberance shown here as with the pastel colors and mythological scenes in France. So the light, airy openness that is so common in Rococo art is appropriate for a ceiling painting that opens up to the heavens themselves, showcasing this important religious event. So the light airiness is accompanied again, as in French Rococo art, with this Baroque zigzag that moves us side to side as we ascend further and further up, until finally we get to the holiest of the figures in the clouds, with the Virgin Mary and Christ child, waiting to approve the establishment of the devotion of the Rosary below by Saint Dominic. Below we can see Saint Dominic, who is backed by the Virgin and Child in de sotto in su view, or from below up, mastered by the Venetians, in this appropriately complex spatial section here, which is going to connect the physicality of the viewers below as we ascend up this physical staircase to this saint, who is our segue, our way to access the divine beyond him. We find that this is going to be very popular and carried on in the late Baroque period and Rococo for Italian painters well into the 18th century, such as Corrado Giaquinto here, seen in the St. Louis Art Museum. Turning to England, as throughout history, we have a very different artistic tradition that reflects the differing socioeconomic structure of the country as compared to their European counterparts. Here we find that the Rococo fails to take root, since there is more of a demand for easel paintings instead of large ceiling frescoes or the decoration of aristocratic residences. Instead, nobility would decorate their homes with old master paintings, specifically those from the Renaissance. Here we find artists would be hired instead for creating portraits if they were to gain any bit of notoriety in the 18th century, such as Thomas Gainsborough in his portrait of Mary, Countess of Howe. In comparing British portraiture to earlier versions, whereby a woman's status and her role as a wife and mother was paramount, we have a slightly different approach, as this is not a modern snapshot. Instead, it is a contrived conveyance of social status that is carefully engineered to show a woman's place as part of a royal family, a royal heritage, and or the property that they own. The model that we have here, which is quite interesting, is that nobles are going to owe their station to the land, so therefore it's quite common to show them in a landscape. It is not incidental that they will often be shown in a rather bucolic surrounding that is not meant to relate to the beauty of the woman, but instead the land that the family owns. The virtuosity of the brushwork seen here, and once again the free sketching, both relate to the French Rococo, but it is more controlled and less, once again, overtly erotic as in French examples. So you find that the British taste for costume and fashion is going to be more reserved, without the plunging necklines and skin that is shown. Now, in considering patronage in the art market, we should think about how these different countries are going to be paying their artists and how they make a living. For instance, Tiepolo, as just mentioned, represents the old tradition, whereby he worked on very large commissions in these frescoed ceiling paintings with multiple assistants. Boucher, on the other hand, represents the new emerging market, working instead on small commissions. We know that he is going to make around 50,000 livres annually. To give you an idea, a Paris University professor only took home 1,900 livres a year. So artists were very well paid if they were working for a royal patron and had steady work. Gainsborough, for instance, was a portrait painter and worked by way of the head and full-length figure. So he would receive 30 guineas, the equivalent of $6,500 today, per head that he painted, or 100 guineas for a full-length portrait. This would easily equate to $200,000 annually in today's money. So we find that both of these examples of Boucher and Gainsborough worked for wealthy patrons. But what about other artists? Now, if you were to work directly for the open market, like Jean-Baptiste Chardin, there is a different way in which you can, of course, establish yourself. So here we find a sober middle-class interior with two children, an older girl and a younger boy. And yes, boys did wear dresses at this time and did so until the 20th century. Here we find that the action and the narrative is limited because that was the taste for these middle-class audiences that would be purchasing this on the open market. We find here the notion of dress for children did not really change until the second half of the 20th century after World War II, when young boys would be dressed different than girls. Here is one of our previous presidents as a child. Now, if we are to compare Chardin's example, we find that it's very familiar and similar to the genre scenes that were popular in the Dutch North. And of course, we find that the British also were sympathetic to these scenes of everyday life that reinforce a social moray or a belief. Now here's the second income. You can sell the painting in the Chardin's example, but you can also make money off of the reproductions of the painting. And this had a much wider market appeal because more people can afford them, and they're sold in series. Going back to Albrecht Dürer and German printmaking of the Renaissance, he found that it's much more lucrative to sell 1,000 prints than one painting. Here we find that there is a caption that also makes very clear for a wider audience what you should take from this. For it reads, "The sister slyly laughs as her little brother who hems and haws through his prayer. He does not care, but hurries on, spurred on by his appetite." Therefore, we're developing characters even further for what we're looking at, such as the greedy little boy and the sly girl. So you can see how this is going to be a mirror image of the original painting. And this tells us about the process by which it was reproduced with printmaking. This, in fact, was created by way of an engraving, which takes place on a copper plate, using a burin, a press, and the plate itself. You would gouge out sections from this metal plate with a very sharp implement, this instrument called a burin. You then, of course, are going to press ink into the grooves and lay a paper on top. You have a press which forces the paper down into these cut areas, this intaglio printing, meaning to cut into, and then it's going to pull the ink out of these recesses. Therefore, we can make lines by pushing the burin into the metal and carve very deeply. It also creates very crisp and clean lines with rough edges that are often smoothed down with a scraper before printing takes place. Taking advantage of this new market, we have William Hogarth, who is going to paint and also print with the market in mind of the middle class. He specialized in social satire and printed soap operas in series and limited editions, allowing his customers to subscribe to get the next part of the series each time it came out. He is best known for his series on a sad marriage that was arranged, where the daughter comes from a rich bourgeoisie merchant or a middle-class merchant, and the son from an impoverished aristocrat. The same subject and the same theme seen in Tim Burton's Corpse Bride. Now, the elegance and the extravagance seen in Rococo painting and the dalliances of aristocrats who are going to celebrate and flaunt their extramarital affairs is going to be mocked in England, right? You find that artists who specialize in social satire, like William Hogarth, is going to be made famous for his paintings that he turns into prints in series and sells them to the general public. And one of his most famous is going to be mocking the type of aristocratic union that we see them celebrating in France in his marriage contract or marriage a la mode series. So here we have the story of a wealthy man whose family has money, the man seen all the way at the left, right, with a snuff box, who's very disinterested in his new bride directly to his left. Her family is very wealthy as a merchant and are up and coming in the world, but need a name. So we find that the fathers of the two are seated at the table. One, right, once again, is given money in exchange for the royal lineage that's growing out of this tree from this knight's stomach here, right? So obviously we have a marriage that is not based on the sacrament of marriage in the Catholic tradition or love, but instead purely for shrewd financial benefit. The result of this from the English tradition, mocking the wealthy unions, especially those relating to the aristocracy. After the marriage here, we find that the husband is going to waste away his newfound and ill-gotten monies from his wife's fortune in, once again, brothels, such as paintings seen here as in The Orgy, where we have him engaging with women of ill repute. Can be seen here in Marriage a la Mode 2, the second in this series, where the couple is married and we see that the husband, who has a very prominent black mark on his neck at the far right, is going to show us that he already has a sexually transmitted disease, much like syphilis, that he has women's undergarments in his coat pocket that the dog is sniffing at and is going to pull out. He has just returned home and is quite exhausted from a night of gallivanting in bordellos and brothels with prostitutes, having taken off his belt and sitting down next to the fire. The wife very slyly looks at him as she is going to be kept up all night herself by her lover in the background, whose pants are still missing. And then we have the music teacher here, who is very exasperated at the young lady's lack of attempt at learning the violin, which has been cast on the floor. So we find that the couple's union is going to end very tragically. The series ends with the Earl actually contracting a venereal disease, as mentioned, and he dies. The wife, of course, was also unfaithful and commits suicide by way of laudanum. So she is seen here with people taking her rings and their child crying at the death of their mother, whereby off to the side we see a starving dog stealing food from the table. And this, of course, is very fitting, and those in the middle class loved seeing these stories of the wealthy suffering in the same way that they do, in once again their ill-gotten gain and their lascivious lifestyle and immoral behavior, giving their comeuppance in the end, thus reinforcing social mores for the middle class. These paintings and printed series were very popular with the well-to-do middle class. We find that they would purchase them and frame and hang them in their parlors. And generally, the subjects, such as Jen Lane here, are going to reinforce the morals of this particular group of people. So here we have the afflictions of Jen, the crack of its day as it was understood, and what it does to the poor and this society. Being that they are, in fact, the middle class, that being above peasants and below, once again, the aristocracy, we find that the themes very often mock the two together, such as with Jen Lane a moment ago, mocking the poor and their behavior and the afflictions caused by alcohol, and at the same time also mocking the aristocracy for their illicit behavior. So we find that there is always a reason for the themes that are chosen here, and generally it panders to a particular audience that's intended to be selling to. Building on our discussion of the different social classes, it's important to note that artists came from the middle class. And this is very important to consider when we look at the evolution and the involvement of arts education and how that helps shape what type of art is produced and the subject matter and style. We see that at the end of the Renaissance, an evolution away from the medieval structure of the guild system, which was an organization that oversaw the training and execution of a particular craft, whether that be physicians, butchers, bakers, or artists. We find that artists, like all of these various guilds working within them, had workshops whereby a young boy would be apprenticed to a master who oversaw the workshop, and in exchange for education would learn how to do what the master does, and eventually, of course, go out and set up his own workshop and take on apprentices himself. By the time we get to the 18th century, we have academies that begin replacing this guild system, whereby, much like a university today, artists would go to get training. These, of course, began first in 1568 in Florence with the Accademia del Disegno, followed by the Accademia di San Luca in Rome, and then the Royal Academy in France and England. These, of course, expanded to Vienna, Madrid, Copenhagen, St. Petersburg, and London. So we find that this old system of workshops and apprenticeships was replaced by this new form of education. Now we find that both the guilds and the academies keep the quality of art high through competition with one another. For instance, the British Royal Academy never had more than 40 members at a time, meaning they were extremely competitive. You had to compete for entrance. Even the French Academy, that let in a large number of artists, still would compete with the Prix de Rome that we already discussed. Artists would annually submit work to be considered for this study abroad in Rome, paid for by the French government. But beginning in 1737, the Academy exhibitions became annual, whereby instead of submitting all of these works by the students and those wishing to join the Academy, it became so popular that it began being shown publicly annually and then biannually. Now these were called salons in France, specifically because they're named after a large reception room called the Salon Carré. And here we can see what these would have looked like, with multiple paintings, generally history paintings in France, within one unified space. Obviously, as their popularity grew, so too did the number of rooms or salons that would showcase these works of up-and-coming artists. Now, these would be open to the general public. Thus, we start to see a democratization of the arts, that being the public now has a say and not just those tastemakers within the academy or the king himself. Artists could make their names in this way, but were not allowed to sell directly to the public. You would actually have a catalog that you would be handed while entering a salon that would show you the addresses for the artists, and you could go to their private atelier or workshops where they're producing these works and buy them directly from them. We find that dealers would, of course, avoid contemporary art, such as in England, and instead would look to buying older works. And so this situation will lead to the new art market as we know it. Now, we must understand the hierarchy of the arts to understand the placement of it within these salons. History paintings, which are meant to be hung because they're very large, would be towards the ceiling. Then you would have portraits, then below them landscapes, genre scenes, and finally still lives. Not only did the progression and the sequence here of how they were hung relate to the size and the distance from which you were to see them. For instance, history paintings are the largest and you can see them from the furthest away, so you put them on the top, but they also are the most coveted and most respected of the genres. Just as we discussed in the first of the lectures of this class, it moves from history painting down to still life, that being the type of genre that requires the most education, knowledge of the human form and history, to the one that requires none, that being still lives do not show humans and don't show episodes from history. It is within this historical milieu that we see the birth of the art critic, as art criticism becomes more and more popular through pamphlets and periodicals, as the public wants to know what they should like and why. Thus they became the tastemakers, like Lafont de Saint-Yenne, the self-styled critic who would write reflections on some causes of the current state of painting in France in 1746. Thus one of the early art critics that would receive popular acclaim and that people would read to understand what type of art they should like. So artists, in turn, would attack these critics because they were not used to outsiders criticizing their work by their writing and in caricatures, such as seen here, whereby you see the art critic portrayed as a blind man who does not understand art, with a cane and with a dog, a seeing-eye dog, if you will. Saint-Yenne is going to demand that artists abandon frivolous subjects at this time, speaking on behalf of the middle class and to the middle class. They did not care for these aristocratic scenes of love and frivolity. He wanted to tone them down by way of seriousness, both through classicism in style, a return to the idealized style based on classical statuary, and classicism in subject matter, that from classical antiquity. Thus, he proposed the foundation of public museums for the artists to study, because most could not see these classical works because they were in private collections, such as the Pope's private collection at this time, or the King of France's private collection. Diderot, for instance, would criticize Boucher for his excesses of sensuality, stating that imagination of a man who passes his life with the lowest class of prostitute must have actually painted this. Hence, we see these repeated attacks from the outside of this aristocratic circle for the seemingly frivolous and pointless works that are going to celebrate immorality as they understand it. Thus, they're going to attack this immorality with a new type of art that's going to appreciate, much as we discussed a moment ago with Hogarth and other types of work that would satirize what they saw in aristocratic works. Thus, this would be preferred by Chardin, Jean-Baptiste Greuze, and others who would, of course, showcase edifying themes. So Jean-Baptiste Greuze, like Chardin, would of course have as his subjects works that would elevate the acts and the morality of the middle class and monumentalize it, such as here in Filial Piety or The Paralytic of 1763. whereby we have the grandfather of a home paralyzed by a stroke and cared for by his family. Hence, we have a strongly held belief by the middle class that one should help your elders. One should support them in their old age, as, of course, they supported you in your youth. Thus, if we compare this to Rococo art, we can see middle-class life reflected here and middle-class problems. Thus, the virtuous examples that are set forth by artists like Chardin and Greuze are a lifetime away, worlds away from the aristocratic dalliances seen in the fêtes galantes of Watteau and others. So we see this as a reaction of the middle class to the perceived debauchery of the aristocracy. But what is interesting is the aristocracy purchased paintings like this, showcasing these middle class values, and vice versa. The middle class also purchased these fêtes galantes, or these mythological scenes showing aristocrats in love. Regardless of the taste of either class, what we see happening overall in both the French and British Academy is a move towards a new type of style and subject matter that elevated and promoted virtue and combated vice, generally with scenes taken from antiquity or of everyday life, interestingly enough. In charge of this would be Count Charles-Claude d'Angevilliers, who would initiate this change as Director General of Buildings, Gardens, Arts Academies, and Royal Manufactories of the King. So finally here we have this encouragement to revive history painting with a moral content, specifically in France under Louis XVI, whereby the government's position was that art should promote civic virtue and combat vice, using it as a way to curb crime, for instance. Out of this initiative came paintings like The Death of Du Guesclin by Nicolas Guy Brenet of 1777, awarded this commission in the Salon for a Greco-Roman French history painting that illustrates, of course, religious piety, generosity, hard work, heroic resolve, respect for virtue, and respect for morality, everything that they were looking for with this new initiative. We find that Brenet was actually a student of Boucher, and we see here an episode from the 100 Years' War where a French constable died trying to win back the English-occupied city, whereby the commander surrenders the keys of the city to him, thus, of course, rewarding his courage and virtue. Even though he lost his life, it was for the good of the French people. Here we find a serious and moralizing theme like that of Greuze, but the respect here for historical accuracy is also as significant and will be seen moving forward, especially with those subjects of Greco-Roman antiquity. For we find that Brenet carefully studies medieval imagery, including the costumes and coloring, even the stitching that we have here, to make sure that his image is accurate of these keys being delivered in the death of this great hero. If we were to compare it to that of a Rococo example from 2 decades earlier, we can see that the color palette is much more natural and the chiaroscuro much more dramatic. It is no longer light-hearted and pastel and airy. In addition, we move through the work in one direction, very clearly reading it from left to right, as we see the keys delivered on this platter, at the left kneeling at the base of the funeral pyre or bed of this man who gave his life. So moving off into the darkness as he himself fades into death and darkness as well, while people around him mourn and cry over his death. So we find that this is going to be this new style that is appreciated, that moves away from this type of sensuous excess and a celebration of jouissance with the Rococo. D'Angevilliers also had commissioned a series of full-length portraits of great men of France, which were to inspire French youth to virtue and intellectual achievement, and especially to have pride in their country, and to promote this idea of patriotism, both, of course, to the good of French society as a whole, but also, once again, to lower crime and to increase civic engagement. Here we see we have several several different examples by Jean-Antoine Houdon, such as an admiral, right, here we go, de Trouville of the French Navy, or Voltaire, the great writer, all of which are meant to showcase how important the French people were, and the great leaders that came before them. This can be found in a counterpart in England with the first president of the British Royal Academy, Sir Joshua Reynolds. Here he would write in his discourses on art that we should return to the greatness of style seen in the high Renaissance masters of Michelangelo and Raphael. Here we find that the aesthetic criteria of classical antiquity are brought to bear for new contemporary subjects such as portraiture in what he would call the grand manner. So here, such as with the portrait of Mrs. Siddons as the Tragic Muse of 1784, he would dress his sitters in this grand style as Greek goddesses or muses. In this example, it's drawing directly from and is inspired by the Sistine Chapel ceiling with the pose of the prophet Isaiah, whereby we have this twisting of the body, a lifting of the left hand, as once again they move off to the right to listen to someone. In this instance, instead of listening to an angel to inspire you to write about the prophesied Messiah, she's going to be listening to the muses behind her, and thus playing a role, elevating her above the everyday. If we look at Thomas Gainsborough and others, there is the same subject of Sarah Siddons again, we can see that there is a difference in Rococo style and this new grand manner. We see now that we have an elevated importance seen behind the figures. We might use the same type of mythological imagery, but at the same time, we do not have the same influence on frivolity or elevating or sexualizing the subjects. We find that the clothing are props for the station in life of these individuals and the significance of what we're looking at and what they represent. Thus, we see a move towards more substance in the works. Instead of the point of a work being merely the pleasure of looking at something in erotic titillation and delectation, we now have an intellectual depth associated with it, which is exactly what Sir Joshua Reynolds was looking for. And next time, we will continue by talking about this new approach that valued gravitas and seriousness and communicating civic virtues with early neoclassicism.